Imagine a Viking king kneeling in the mud, not with the swagger of a raider but with the raw fear of a man begging a stranger's god for mercy. The summer sky over Upola is a low leaden bowl, wind tastes of brine and smoke. Longships lie beached like wounded beasts along a marshy shore. Men who hours before had sung of glory and Valhalla now press their hands to the cross, clutch rosaries, whisper names of saints. It is 854 AD, and for the Norse this is not a skirmish. It is a humiliation that will echo around the Baltic for decades. Meet the tribe that forced that prayer, the Curonians, Baltic seafarers who turned geography, wealth, and a fierce maritime culture into a weapon that made Vikings think twice. The Northerners have claimed the oceans, but the Baltic is not an open highway. It is a littered labyrinth of shoals, spits, channels, and shallow lagoons. Along that rim of sea, what we now call Courland, and parts of the islands of Saaremaa and the Curonian Spit, lived peoples the medieval chroniclers lumped together as heathens, but whom modern scholarship recognizes as distinct Balts, Curonians and their island cousins, the Oselians. They were not peripheral peasants. Archaeology reveals workshops for amber, hoards of foreign coins, and hill forts bristling with palisades. They were merchants, but also warriors, organized in a way that married commercial interest to military readiness. The Amber Road made them wealthy. Amber is not only pretty. In the early medieval world it is currency and status symbol, a commodity that links the Baltic to the Mediterranean and the Arab world. Burials in Curonian territory yield Roman and Arab dirhams, beads, and glasswork. Archaeological evidence that Courland was plugged into long-distance trade networks. That wealth invited attention. The Vikings came for plunder, for prestige, and sometimes for serviceable alliances. But the Curonians did not simply wait with purses open. Their economy had created a warrior class whose lives were structured around protecting coastal assets, moving fast across the water, and turning the sea itself into an instrument of defense. To understand how they made Vikings hesitate, start with the coastline. Picture a map where the shorelines are less like crisp lines and more like a riddle. The Curonian Spit is a slender tongue of sand, a moving landscape of dunes and lagoons. Saaremaa and the other islands form an offshore archipelago, and the mainland is cut with estuaries and river mouths that run shallow and treacherous. For a ship built to dominate open seas, these conditions are a nightmare. The Viking longship is a masterpiece. Clinker-built planks, a flexible hull, a shallow keel for beach landings, and a single sail that makes long-distance raiding efficient. But it is optimized for speed and waves that carry you. Put that same design into a maze of shallows and it becomes a hulking liability. The Curonians and Oselians built different craft. Archaeological evidence, including boat remains and depictions on boundary stones and artifacts, points to flatter-bottomed, more maneuverable vessels. Smaller, crew-heavy boats, capable of sliding over shoals and slipping into reed-choked inlets. They favored numbers and local knowledge. Where a Viking warband sought the shock of a well-executed landing and the psychological terror of a sudden assault, the Balts preferred ambushes that turned speed and surprise against the Viking profile. In these waters, it was easy to bait a longship into a half-tide channel, close the exits with submerged stakes or shore-laid nets, and then press the attack where the larger ship could neither tack nor retreat. The mechanics deserve a closer look because the confrontation between these two naval cultures was not merely brute force. It was a chess match shaped by hull curves and hidden sandbars. The longship's keel and rocker allowed it to ride ocean swells and to beach easily, but its length and lighter beam made it vulnerable in constricted water where turning meant losing momentum. The Curonian raider, often described by later chroniclers as faster to row, lower to the water, and able to fight in shallows, could surround a longship, sever its oars, or simply wait for the tide to trap it. In some cases, the Balts used corded booms or submerged poles to entangle rudders. In others, they relied on purely tactical patience, shadowing a Viking flotilla until nightfall, then slipping out to cut ships off from each other. This was not theory. The sources, of varied reliability and steeped in the biases of their writers, records several episodes where northern arrogance met the brutal logic of Baltic literal warfare. Saxo Grammaticus, writing in the 12th century and mixing history with literary flourish, tells of Danish expeditions that ended in catastrophe. Far closer to the events, Rimbert's Vita Ansgari, a 9th century text that chronicles ecclesiastical missions in the Baltic, records an episode in which Swedish forces were routed at Upola, forced to seek refuge and mercy. Rimbert's purpose is pastoral and political, to show Christian efforts and the challenges they faced. But his report, taken alongside archaeological finds of armor and foreign goods in Curonian contexts, suggests a real capacity for organized, decisive resistance. One of the earliest and most dramatic blows occurred in 853, when a Danish fleet reportedly sailed into a trap and was overwhelmed. The chroniclers are not meticulous statisticians. They do not give us reliable casualty counts, and they often balloon defeats into moral lessons. Still, the pattern is consistent. A Viking force, confident in its ability to press ashore and sack, was hemmed in by tides or cut off from retreat. The result was not a measured battle so much as a collapse. Leadership lost, ships disabled, men stranded. Saxo relates these misadventures with a mix of gloating and admonition, while later Livonian sources echo the same theme, that the Balts could and did turn the sea against those who thought themselves masters of it. Upola, in 854, crystallizes the inversion. Remember the image of a Viking king praying? Rimbert writes of an uneasy landing, of Norse forces compelled to build a makeshift camp and then besieged by the locals. The hill fort of Upola, a network of earthworks, palisades, and timber and earth ramparts sited on a fen lake, was built not to confront an army on an open field, but to command the few routes through the marshes and to interdict ships attempting to refit or retreat. Inside the fort, defenders could store amber and provisions, and in times of raid the local population would shelter behind the palisade while warriors sallied out to harass. The Viking tactic of beaching and sacking was neutralized when the landing zones themselves belonged to opponents who could fight from concealed positions and retreat into defenses that a frontal assault on open ground could not easily breach. Archaeology supports Rimbert's outline. Excavations at multiple Baltic sites reveal strong defenses dated to the 9th and 10th centuries. Deep ditches, timbered palisades, and layers of burning and refortification indicative of repeated attack and defense. Finds include not just local pottery and tools but foreign material, dirhams, glass beads, and occasional fragments of northern armor, suggesting both trade and contested spoils. These material traces indicate that the Curonians were not passive victims of contact. They were active participants in a violent, mobile economy. But technology and fortification are only parts of the story. Strategy is also psychological. The Curonians cultivated a reputation, a dark, ambiguous aura that played on Norse expectations of warfare, sanctity, and fate. The Norse valorized a particular kind of battlefield death, a man fallen in glorious combat whose soul might be swept to Valhalla. The Curonians, according to several chronicles and later reports, practiced rites and rituals that struck at that expectation. Some Norse writers imply that the Balts enacted religious practices that were gruesome or strange by Scandinavian standards, sacrifices, the use of seers, and divination that indicated a willingness to transgress sacred limits. Henry of Latvia and the Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, later medieval sources with their own agendas, repeat tales of sacrificial lots and terrifying omens. Modern historians debate how much of this is reportage and how much is rhetorical demonization used to justify crusade. There is also evidence that Curonian tactics incorporated displays designed to unnerve. The use of painted masks, drums, and staged rituals before the fight. These displays may have served to intimidate, but also to communicate cohesion and willingness to fight to the bitter end. In the context of medieval warfare, reputation had operational value. If a raiding party feared that capture could lead not only to death but to a sacrificial fate, morale could collapse. The Norse sagas, with their emphasis on honor, oath, and fate, show moments where reputation tilts the battle. A single account of a missed landing or a routed leader passes quickly through saga prose, But the cumulative effect was strategic. Fleets began to adjust to be more cautious, to scout longer, to avoid certain bays. We must be careful here. Sensational claims, ritual cannibalism, mass human sacrifice, appear in some sources, but are contested by archaeologists and scholars. Graves do not uniformly yield the kind of grisly evidence that would confirm large-scale ritual killing, and later Christian chroniclers had strong incentives to cast pagan practices as monstrous. The historian's task is to present both the reports and the doubt, to acknowledge that for the Norse the Curonian image was as much constructed as observed. Still, even if ritual claims are exaggerated, the psychological instrument remained real. Fear, magnified through rumor and selective eyewitness accounts, changed behavior. Tactics evolved in a feedback loop. The Norse adjusted, longer scouting missions, heavier reliance on intelligence from traders and converts, or alliances with local chieftains. But the Balts adapted too. Their ships were often crewed in larger numbers relative to size, trading raw shock for the ability to swarm. They used the coastline as a trapmaker uses terrain, arranging ambushes where tidal rhythms meant the enemy's options shrank to nothing. Tactical ingenuity included hauling small boats over land to outflank a longship fleet, or night raids on beached ships where the attackers could cut moorings and take prizes without open battle. A vivid vignette recorded in several sources, again told in paraphrase because the chroniclers love to dramatize, is the capture and reuse of Viking equipment. After certain encounters, Curonian warriors returned to their beaches with recovered shields, weapons, and even armor, which were then displayed as trophies. Some archaeological sites show northern-style weapons interred alongside Baltic grave goods, suggesting a transfer and assimilation of material culture. This was not mere looting, it was symbolic. To strip a Viking of his shield and wear it in a procession was to humiliate, and to claim mastery over that martial identity. Chroniclers in Scandinavia noted with embarrassment that their own gear had become trophies in foreign cemeteries. The interplay between maritime tech and ritual reputation culminated in operations that were less about pitched battles and more about systematic interdiction. The Curonians did not always seek to annihilate an enemy. Often their goal was to make certain coastal zones unusable, to deny coves to raiders, to make resupply a gamble, to force a choice, risk a landward route that required alliances with other Baltic chieftains, or accept the potential trap of the sea. This strategy was informed by a logic we would now call area denial. In the constrained waters of the eastern Baltic, that logic was lethal. Small mobile strikes could yield outsized strategic effects. Take the Danish disaster of 853. Whether exaggerated or underplayed, the message reached Scandinavian courts. Don't assume the Baltic is a free hunting ground. Upola, a year later, provided a theatrical retort. A force that could drive a Viking detachment into supplication was a force that demanded recalibration. Rimbert's ecclesiastical perspective in Vita Anscari is important precisely because it underscores the political fallout. His narrative shows how church missions intersected with secular power and how military setbacks impeded evangelizing efforts. For the Swedes, the shame of Upola was both a psychic wound and a political embarrassment. The Christian veneer of superiority, sword and cross, had been tested against a local power that used neither feudal heavy cavalry nor stone castles, but instead the craft of the shore. Regional networks amplified these effects. The Curonians did not operate in total isolation. They traded, raided, and sometimes allied with neighboring Baltic groups. The Oselians, from the island of Saramaya, were often partners and occasional rivals. They shared a maritime culture and a willingness to fight. Together, their actions shaped a Baltic polity that was loose but effective. Local chieftains who could muster warriors quickly, who had the local knowledge to manipulate tides and sands, and who were motivated not only by plunder but by the defense of commerce and the protection of community resources. And yet for all their success, the Curonians were not invulnerable. Nor were their victories peaceful or permanent. The very wealth that made them able to field boats and palisades also made them targets for larger political currents. Traders and warriors from Scandinavia were joined over time by merchants and warriors from Russia's and German lands. The Baltic became a stage for increasingly organized, more heavily armed incursions that tested the limits of Curonian maritime tactics. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, before the great crusading orders marshaled the resources of Western Christendom, the Curonians were the dominant littoral force, a regional power whose strategies forced a re-evaluation of Viking tactics and assumptions. To appreciate this fully, we need to zoom into daily life inside a hill fort to feel the tactical rhythms that shaped strategic choices. A hill fort like Upola sat where water met earth in complex ways, ringed by marshes, positioned to surveil multiple channels, and constructed with an economy of timber and earthworks that allowed rapid repair after raids. Life inside a fort was not monastic. It was practical. Storage pits for grain, racks for boats, forges for repair, workshops for amber polishing, and communal spaces where agreements were made. Men could be mustered within hours. Women, children, and old men could retreat behind palisades that were more than symbolic. In periods of threat, the fort's garrison operated on local intelligence. Scouts watched not just for sails on the horizon, but for the small clues that betrayed a Viking presence: upriver cuttings, smoke on an unexpected shore, a change in trader routes. When a Viking fleet appeared, the defenders did not necessarily rush out en masse. The first objective was to deny the landing. Stakes, booms, and submerged obstacles could be placed in predictable channels. Fences of interwoven wood could snag oars or tear hulls. At night, lookouts used the flat wetlands to their advantage. Sound travels differently over shallow water, and a small craft paddling quietly could slip into a harbor unseen. Dawn, then, was often a time of ambush, the moment when the longships, beached and unloading, were at their most vulnerable. In many of these engagements, ordinary tactical tools, local reconnaissance, the use of tides, small arms tactics, outstripped the glamour of big battles. Yet chronicles remember grand moments: the capture of a prince, a fleet driven onto rocks, a cathedral gate carried off as loot. These dramatic images stick because they are symbolic. They map local victory onto the broader stage. A Baltic raid that reached Sigtuna centuries later, for example, was not just plunder. It was a statement that the coastal masters could run raids deep into Sweden and strike at the heart of Christian urban culture. But that event is part of a later chapter in which different forces are in play. For now, in the mid-9th century, the interaction looks like this. Viking aggression meets Baltic maritime craft and local defense. The resulting clashes produce humiliation and tactical adaptation on both sides. Reputation and ritual amplify the psychological stakes, and the line between commerce and combat blurs. The Curonians do not defeat the Vikings systematically across every theater, but they force selective defeats that reshape behavior. A Viking lord who has seen his ships trapped in a lagoon thinks twice before trusting the sea alone. A monk sent to convert a coastal chief knows that piety will not shield his flotilla from a well-laid trap. This is the inversion. The predator of the north becomes prey to a coastline that knows its secrets. And there were moments when that predator-turned prey took trophies home. After Upola and similar encounters, Curonian assemblages contained objects of Norse manufacture. In cemeteries, archaeologists find blades, rivets, and even fragments of mail that likely originated in Scandinavia. These items tell a double story of conflict and connectivity. Warfare produced looting, but looting produced material exchange and sometimes technical borrowing. There is evidence that Baltic shipwrights observed and incorporated elements of northern construction, just as Norsemen borrowed aspects of Baltic seamanship. Material cultures braided together, even as political control waxed and waned. Yet the strategic balance remained precarious. Viking fleets could and did learn. They employed scouts, sought alliances with coastal chiefs opposed to Curonian dominance, and adapted their own tactics to avoid predictable traps. The Norse were not a monolithic force. They were flexible, opportunistic, and resourceful. When faced with an unfamiliar maritime logic, they changed routes, adopted local craft, or mounted reprisals that aimed to punish the coastal communities economically. The medieval sources often highlight revenge raids and punitive expeditions meant to deter future assaults. These were not always successful. Tactical adaptation takes time, and the sea gives advantage to the side that better knows its moods. Still, the interplay between adaptation and counter-adaptation hardened into a pattern that defined decades of Baltic history. Naval technology, geography, wealth, and reputation combined to create localized power structures capable of repelling northern raiders. The Viking image, the unstoppable seaborne predator, had to be revised in light of these facts. For Scandinavians operating in the eastern Baltic, success required more than seamanship. It required humility, intelligence, and sometimes diplomacy. That revision had consequences beyond the immediate theater. News of defeats and humiliations traveled. Merchants rerouted, bishops delayed missions, and princes reconsidered the political value of eastern expansion. In the short term, Baltic success maintained local autonomy and secured trade routes. In the long run, however, the same wealth that protected the Curonians also attracted new, larger predators, Western Christendom's crusading orders and the militarized polities of the German East. Those forces would bring armor, stone, and an ideological fervor that reshaped the region in ways the Curonians could not easily counter. But that shift is part of a later story, one in which the balance tips, castles appear, and crusading armies test the limits of coastal resistance. For now, the narrative stays on the water and in the marshes. The Curonians have proven they can make a Viking rethink a landing, a raid, or a seaborne sermon. They have the forts to deny sanctuary, the boats to stalk and swarm, and a reputation that unsettles the northern sense of fate. The medieval world watches and judges, sometimes unfairly. Chroniclers color the tale with religious and political motives, yet their reports converge on a clear fact. The Baltic littoral was not a passive backwater. It was a crucible where naval technology, local knowledge, and cultural practice combined to neutralize one of Europe's most feared warbands. And in those marshy rings and sanded spits, the story keeps unfolding. Alliances formed and broken, innovations in shipbuilding, exchanges of weapons and ritual. The Viking world adjusts. So do the Balts. The next episodes in this confrontation will reach inland, strike at symbolic centers, and draw in actors from beyond the Baltic Rim. The Curonians' mastery of littoral warfare will provoke responses that escalate from raiding and ambush to organized campaigns worthy of chronicler and pope alike. But before the Crusaders and the mounted knights arrive with castle-building zeal, before the sack of Sigtuna and the campaigns of the 13th century redraw political maps, the Curonians have already done something crucial. They forced northern kings to recognize that dominance at sea could be contested, that the sea itself could be turned into an instrument of defense, and that the myth of Viking invincibility had a fragile, local limit. If this hidden chapter of the Viking Age catches your curiosity, take a moment to like and subscribe. There's much more to unfold about how a coastline shaped empires and how material culture preserves the echoes of those encounters. Beyond that click, the immediate story tightens. Upola's aftermath sends shockwaves. News travels by trader and captive alike. Reputation morphs into strategy. In some Swedish courts, the shame of defeat becomes a political problem. How to restore honor, how to secure amber routes, how to compel coastal chiefs to accept tribute rather than resistance. These are not questions answered by a single raid. They invite larger campaigns, diplomatic maneuvers, and, crucially, the involvement of neighbors who see opportunity in chaos. Back on the shore, meanwhile, the Curonian leaders are practical. They repair palisades, redistribute plunder, and send scouts not only to watch for Norse sails, but to trace merchants' routes inland. Their resources are finite, their communities vulnerable to winter famine and the politics of neighboring tribes. Each victory demands consolidation, more watches, deeper alliances, and the occasional offensive to keep rivals off balance. The balance between trade and war becomes a daily calculus. The same amber that funds boats also fuels desire, both to protect and to expand. Against this background of tactical cunning and local resilience, one later episode stands out as a symbolic mic drop, an incursion many years hence that will carry Baltic shame into Swedish town centers. But we are getting ahead of the map. For now, the maritime duel continues, a sequence of raids, rescues, and repairs that will eventually accumulate into the kind of bold operation that topples gates and shatters complacency. The stage is set. The players have learned their lines. and as long as the Baltic shoals remain the keeper of secrets, any seafarer who ventures without it will carry into his bones the knowledge that even the most fearsome predator can, in the right place, become prey. The sea keeps its own calendar, and in the years after Upola, that calendar read as a ledger of grudges. Word moves slow and sharp along trade routes. An oar snapped at low tide, a cohort turned to scrap on a sandbank, a shield paraded on a foreign beach. Those images multiply into reputation. By the time the medieval world stops skimming for the moment and begins to count consequences, the violence of the literal has become political currency. One raid is an item in a ledger. 10 raids are a story told in halls. A humiliating sack lodges like a stone in a ruler's shoe. The sack of Sigtuna in 1187 is that kind of stone. To modern eyes, Sigtuna looks like a modest town on a map of medieval Sweden. To contemporaries, it was a symbol, a royal and ecclesiastical center, a place where kings minted coin and bishops walked in ceremonial robes. When a fleet crossed the sea and struck at that symbol, the blow reverberated far beyond the stolen silver. Chroniclers pin the attack on Baltic raiders. Some later Swedish accounts suggest burning, slaughter, and the murder of an ecclesiastical figure, sometimes named as Archbishop Johannes. The sources diverge, and the identity of the attackers has been debated by historians. Some ascribe the raid to Estonians or Oselians, others point fingers at Curonians or a mixed force of Baltic seafarers. The chronicles tell what struck them most, not only loss of goods, but the psychic shock of a seaborne force sacking a Christian town. Some writers even claim that gates or monumental doors were taken eastward, a dramatic image of booty carried to Novgorod or other centers as proof of reach. Such claims are the sort that historians treat with caution. The story appears in multiple narrative traditions, but hard proof, the physical gate with a carved inscription shipped off in a known year, is thin. Still, the event matters less for the precise list of perpetrators than for its message. Coastal raiders could, in the late 12th century, strike into the Swedish heartland and return. For a culture where honor is public, where kings answer slights with force, Sigtuna is a wake-up call. It pushed rulers toward a strategy they had long resisted, the importation of organized foreign military machinery under a Christian banner. Enter the Crusades. The Baltic in the 12th and 13th centuries becomes a different sort of battleground, not simply because of a procession of punitive raids, but because of organized intervention sponsored by the church and backed by knights with horses, armor, and money. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword and later the Teutonic Knights arrive as instruments of a northern crusading movement that blends pious rhetoric with territorial ambition. Papal bulls and crusading indulgences convert local conflicts into a universal crusade against pagans. The rhetoric matters. To chroniclers, such as Henry of Latvia, a priest writing in the early 13th century, the warfare is not merely strategic but moral. To the knights and their sponsors, it is an opportunity to secure land and souls. Henry records battles, conversions, and the process of subjugation in painstaking, if partisan, detail. The new combatants change the arithmetic. Heavy cavalry, fortified stone keeps, crossbows, and siege machinery are not things the literal warriors were built to face. A shoreline ambush can cripple a longship. It cannot on its own bring down a castle. Where the Curonians relied on mobility and local knowledge, the crusading orders brought permanence. They built timber castles that turned into stone. They imposed garrisons whose presence altered trade and politics. These castles were not mere forts. They were instruments of administrative control, toll collection, and the spread of a legal order that favored colonists and ecclesiastical interests over indigenous autonomy. That does not mean the Balts folded immediately. If anything, the arrival of crusading forces elevated the stakes and produced dramatic reversals. At Saul in 1236, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, a military order newly active in the region, met a coalition of Baltic and Samogitian forces and suffered a crushing defeat. Medieval chroniclers record the slaughter of knights, the capture of banners, and the disintegration of an army that had seemed unassailable. The battle did not end Baltic resistance. It forced a recalibration of crusader strategy and eventually led to the absorption of the battered order into the Teutonic fold. Similarly, at Derby in 1260, The Teutonic Knights and their allies were routed by Samogitians and their allies, a victory that sparked revolts among subject peoples and signaled that heavy cavalry could be turned away in the right conditions. These successes, dramatic and morale-boosting, were also paradoxical. They showed that the cavalry and castle model had limits in terrain and against determined opponents. Yet they also hardened the Crusaders' resolve. Losses prompted a strategic pivot. More settlers, more castles, more expensive and methodical campaigns. Where a coastal war once relied on tide and ambush, this new phase relied on logistics, bureaucracy, and the slow, grinding encroachment of institutions. The Balts could still win battles, and they did. But victory in the field no longer guaranteed strategic survival against an adversary who could replace losses with new men drawn from an increasingly pan-European supply of crusaders. For Curonians, the results were mixed and often tragic. Some chieftains chose accommodation over annihilation, accepting baptism and paying tribute while keeping a measure of autonomy. Others fought on and were gradually ground down by attrition, castle building, and the fragmentation of local power networks. The transformation was cultural as well as political. Forced baptisms, the imposition of ecclesiastical law, and the settlement of German-speaking colonists gradually eroded the institutions that made Curonian maritime power possible. Where once a hill fort might muster boats and men at a moment's notice, now that fort might be hemmed in by a castle whose garrison answered to a foreign commander. Still, the story resists simple narratives of disappearance. The Curonians did not vanish like mist. Elements of their society persisted, adapted, or retreated into pockets. A striking example is the phenomenon known in later documents as the Curonian kings, small communities around Kuldega, medieval Caldega, who retained privileges and a degree of autonomy into the early modern period. These were not kings, as a modern reader imagines. They were landholding elites whose title reflected ancient statuses tied to military service and local leadership. Their survival demonstrates that some institutional memory and social structures endured, even as the broader political tapestry changed. The Kursenieki are another example of persistence and adaptation. Living along the thin Curonian spit that separates the lagoon from the open sea, these fishermen and boatmen survived as a distinct maritime community well into modern times, preserving dialects, boat-building traditions, and place-based knowledge. Linguistic and genealogical continuity also leaves traces. Modern Latvians and Lithuanians carry genetic markers that show long-term Baltic presence in the region, and place names retain an imprint of Curonian habitation. These continuities remind us that conquest is not always neat erasure. It is often a complex layering of languages, genes, and material culture. Archaeology fills out this picture in indispensable ways. Excavations in Courland and Saaremaa have turned up amber workshops, hoards of silver dirhams from the Islamic world, glass beads from Mediterranean contexts, and a scatter of northern-made weaponry. One principal lesson of the material record is connectivity. The Curonians were plugged into networks that stretched far beyond the Baltic. Another is resilience. Fortifications show many episodes of burning and repair, indicating repeated conflict, but also the capacity for recovery. Where textual sources are partisan, archaeology provides a corrective, not a complete counter-narrative, but a set of tangible facts that constrain speculation. Yet archaeology also raises questions it cannot fully answer. Burial sites yield northern-type swords in some graves and local pottery in others. Such entanglements suggest exchange, looting, and possibly mercenary service. But whether a sword in a Curonian grave came as part of tribute, booty, trade, or marriage dowry is not always clear. Similarly, supposed ritual deposits are difficult to interpret. Bones or arranged deposits might indicate ritual practice, violent death, or complex mortuary behavior that resists single explanations. Where medieval chroniclers insist on the monstrous, the graves sometimes whisper a more ambiguous tale. That ambiguity is central to a balanced view. When Peter the Chronicler or Saxo Grammaticus writes with a moral or nationalistic edge, they are not lying in the modern sense. They are framing events to serve an argument. Saxo, writing in 12th century Denmark, dramatizes northern exploits in a way that elevates Danish kings and blames foreign enemies. Henry of Livonia, writing for a clerical audience, frames the Baltic Wars as a spiritual struggle. Rimbert, the earlier ecclesiastical chronicler whose Vita Ansgari provides a near-contemporary account of the Upola episode, has his own pastoral and political aims. These authors are indispensable, but their vantage points are also their limits. Oral tradition, too, shapes the record, and then slips away. The Curonians and Oscilians preserved memory through story, ritual, and material culture, rather than through inscriptional habit. When priests, crusaders, and colonists impose a new narrative and new institutions, oral narratives either adapt, are absorbed, or disappear. The result is a historiographical blind spot. We have more written testimony from the conquerors than from the conquered, and that asymmetry colors the story we inherit. Modern historians therefore triangulate. They read the chronicles with skepticism, consult archaeological layers for physical evidence, and compare the material culture of the Baltic with that of its neighbors to discern patterns of exchange and influence. The tactical details, meanwhile, invite a closer look at how a literal people could keep a seaborne predator, the Viking fleet, cautious. The Curonian model combined three interlocking strengths: knowledge of local hydrography, ship design adapted to shoals, and a social organization that linked commerce to defense. The hydrography could be brutal. Shoals change position. Currents move sandbars. A channel that was safe at one tide could become a trap at the next. Curonian pilots read the sea like a map of lives. They knew where a current would leave a longship with no options. They knew which inlet narrowed at mid-tide, and which lagoon held the quiet of a sleeping fleet. Ship design mattered. A light, flat-bottomed craft could slide across sand and grind its way through reed-choked water. It could also put more men near the waterline, which mattered in boarding actions. The typical Curonian raider may have carried fewer metal fittings than a Norse longship, but often made up for it with numbers and flexibility. The pirates and defenders used that flexibility to create tactical dilemmas. Should a Viking leader risk tacking down an uncertain channel to seize an exposed hamlet, or should he refuse and let his warriors go unpaid and disgraced? Many chose caution after enough narrow escapes. Psychology and ritual were the third piece. The medieval battlefield is as much about meaning as about formation. Beliefs about honor, fate, and death shape how a society fights. When chroniclers suggest that Curonians practiced terrifying rites, they are recording observers' impressions that carried operational weight. A reputation for fierceness can deter a raid as effectively as a hidden chain of stakes. The Balts, by sometimes cultivating grim images, whether real or exaggerated, created a force multiplier that extended their material capabilities. Over time, the Viking response entailed two kinds of adaptation. The first was tactical: longer scouts, cautious landings, alliances with local chiefs who offered safe passage. The second was strategic. The preference for temporary plunder shifted in some contexts to colonization and political control. When kings and bishops judged that tribute and temporary raids were insufficient to secure commerce, they turned to permanent solutions: fortresses, missionary networks, and legal claims. Those changes mark a transition from the age of raiding to the age of colonization and state-building in the Baltic. That transition sealed a series of tragedies and survivals. For the Curonians, the consequences ranged from negotiated accommodation to violent subjugation. Many communities were assimilated linguistically and culturally over centuries. Their names survive in toponyms and the low hum of dialects, but the distinct Curonian tongue faded. Genetic markers, however, preserve traces of continuity. Modern population genetics suggest a deep-rooted Baltic substrate in Latvia and Lithuania, indicating that people did not vanish. Rather, their languages, political institutions, and some cultural practices were overwritten by new systems. The difference between genetic continuity and cultural survival is crucial. An unbroken line of ancestry does not equal an unbroken line of social identity. The long-term legacy is also maritime and technological. Boat-building techniques diffused. Shipwrights borrowed aspects of each other's designs. Where the northern hull offered strength on the open sea, The Baltic flat-bottoming offered maneuverability. Over generations, sailors blended these advantages into hybrid craft. Even the iconography of power, trophies, grave goods, and ritual objects reveals a braided culture. A Curonian warrior with a Norse sword in his grave speaks to violence and exchange as twin engines of history. The historiography is instructive in how it shapes modern imagination. For centuries, the Viking image, horned-headed popular myth apart, has dominated the public sense of the medieval North. Raiders who arrived in dragon-proud ships to take what they wanted. The Baltic story complicates that image. It replaces a single predator with a contested ecosystem. It asks readers to picture a mobile chain of actors, each learning from and shaping the sea. The result is a more textured Viking age, one in which the sea is not simply a highway of plunder, but a contested space where local knowledge and tactical innovation can reverse expectations. This is not an apology for violence. It is a recalibration of causality. When historians stress the Curonians' tactical impact, they are not valorizing raids or excusing atrocities. They are doing the historian's work, showing how human beings in a particular place formulate solutions to persistent problems, how geography, economy, and social structure combine to make certain tactics inevitable. The Curonians' reliance on ambush, for instance, is not an ethical choice but a rational response to a specific environment and set of opportunities. By the later Middle Ages, the technological and institutional tide had turned against them. The Crusader states, with their castles and administrative reach, proved resilient. The Teutonic Order and its allies settled land, exploited resources, and integrated local economies into larger networks that favored colonists and clerics. The Curonians adapted where they could and retreated where they could not. Some communities found niches as fishermen, pilots, or local administrators under the new order. A scattering of local elites maintained privileges that testified to ancient prerogatives, but the world in which a shoreline's secrets were a guarantor of independence had been irrevocably transformed. The memory of Baltic resistance, however, did not fade from medieval minds. For Scandinavians, the humiliation of certain raids lingered in saga and chronicle. For crusading clerics, Baltic victories that resisted conversion became proof of the need for ecclesiastical intervention. For modern historians, the Curonians and Oscilians offer a cautionary tale about the limits of simplistic narratives. Their story demands that we read sources critically, combine texts with artifacts, and treat oral tradition as both evidence and silence. It also invites a broader point. Empires and raiders are only as powerful as the environments in which they operate. A coastline that is well known to its inhabitants can be a fortress. A sea can be a blade turned inward on its wielder. In the end, meeting the tribe that made Vikings think twice is less about a single triumph than about a pattern. It is about the slow accumulation of tactical lessons that together undermine a myth. The Vikings were not omnipotent. They were adaptable, daring, and effective across much of Europe. But the Baltic shows that even formidable power runs into limits when faced with terrain-savvy opponents who combine local knowledge, economic interest, and a willingness to exploit every tidal advantage. The Curonians and Oscilians did not invent war, but they refined literal warfare into a coherent strategy that complicated the Viking story. Their legacy is both concrete and elusive. Amber workshops and Durham hordes, hill forts with palisade lines, swords that moved from ship to shore to grave, and names on maps that whisper of long-ago peoples. It is also a historiographical lesson. That history assembled primarily from the conqueror's pen will always be incomplete. To read the Baltic properly is to listen for voices between the lines. The archaeological traces, the scattered oral memories, the place names, and to accept that some answers will remain contested. So, what are we left to take away? First, that geography can be a weapon in itself. A coastline that seems passive can be an active defense when its people know how to read and shape it. Second, that reputation and ritual, even when amplified or distorted by hostile chroniclers, function as tools of war. Third, that technological superiority in one domain, open sea raiding, does not translate into dominance in another, literal interdiction. And finally, that survival is complex. The Curonians did not disappear without a trace. They persisted in genetic lines, in communities like the Curonian kings and Curonians, and in the material record that archaeologists continue to unearth. If the image of a Viking king praying in the mud at Upola forced contemporaries to rethink an entire approach to maritime power, then the centuries that followed show how that rethinking rippled outward. It changed diplomatic choices, it shaped missionary plans, and it invited outside powers who brought castles and crusades. Neither the Vikings nor the Curonians had a monopoly on heroism or brutality. Both left marks on the Baltic that we can still read if we learn to read the right traces. And the sea keeps its ledger. It remembers sand and stake, mast and triumphal gate. It remembers the sound of rowers when they thought themselves masters, and it remembers the quiet when a local pilot had already charted the trap. The story closes not with a final verdict, but with a recognition. The Viking Age, glorious and violent in its own terms, is incomplete without the Baltic counter-chapter. To understand the North, you must understand its literal enemies and neighbors, the people who made bragging Orsches pause, who turned a highway of plunder into a deadly riddle, and who forced even the most audacious seafarers to think twice before trusting the water. If you want to go deeper into how crusades and colonization finished reshaping the Baltic and to see the full arc that carries from Upola to Saul to the eventual absorption of the Curonians, check the linked deep dive on the Prussian Crusade. And if this episode reframed what you thought you knew about Vikings, subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the series.